Munshi, obstetrician in Bansal Hospital. It's my pleasure to welcome you all and the eminent speakers and guests today. It's very good to see everyone after so long, and thankfully we are returning back to normal from the long-lasting COVID times with this physical conference. And to start with, now I call upon our President, Dr. Anjali Kanhare ma'am, for welcome address. She is very well known to everybody, President of Bhopal Obstetric and Gynec Society for this session, Professor and Head in Department of Chirayu Medical College, Bhopal, and she has very many awards to her credit. And ma'am has special interest in high-risk pregnancy and medical education. We welcome you, ma'am.
A wonderful day to see everyone over here and have eminent speakers like Dr. Bela Bhatt, Dr. Hitesh Bhatt, Dr. Priya and Shivani with us. And I'm not going to take a very long time. Let us hope that this kind of events, they keep on happening and we get a very positive input from our Foxy Mumbai Society, because this is a committee workshop, like committee is also involved in it, and I think this is the first one we are having in this year where we are getting speakers from Foxy committee. So I take this pleasure to be here and to invite you all. And as madam was rightly saying, yes madam, Bhopal is a wonderful society. Bhopal is a wonderful place. It is very neat, clean and beautiful. And we all are very happy to have you here. Thank you so much.
Remember the Almighty, so I call upon Ma'am Dr. Manisha Khare Ma'am for Saraswati Vandana.
I would say brainstorming sessions a little later. Let us start with basic things first. Amniotic fluid, the key element in pregnancy, I would say. So to begin with, let us understand the fluid dynamics. In the first trimester of pregnancy, there is a bidirectional diffusion between the fetus and the amniotic fluid across the skin, because the skin is not keratinized in the first trimester. The surface of the amnion, placenta and the umbilical cord, they are all freely permeable to water and solutes. And mind it that fetal urination and swallowing has got no contribution until 14 weeks of pregnancy. Now if we move on to second and third trimester of the pregnancy, the keratinization, echo sound. The keratinization of the skin, it begins by 19 to 20 weeks and it is complete by 25th week. And then the contribution of the fetal urine and the fetal lung fluid production, it starts right from the second trimester. The other contributions, they consist of the oral secretions, nasal secretions and the tracheal secretions. There are two important pathways for this fluid movements and the solute movements. It is a little bit of physics, chemistry involved into amniotic fluid. So the intramembranous pathway, there is a transfer of solutes and the fluid from the amniotic cavity to the fetal circulation across the amniotic membrane. And this is a significant pathway for fluid movement. Another is the transmembranous pathway, which involves direct exchange across the fetal membranes between the fetus and the maternal blood. And this affects the amniotic fluid volume only minimally. So major is the intramembranous pathway. Now the fetal breathing movements, they cause efflux of the lung secretions into the amniotic fluid, and removal is predominantly by the fetal swallowing. extent by all the other secretions, the outflow mainly swallowing, and the intramembranous absorption. So that is how the balance is maintained. We all know the functions of amniotic fluid, mainly the nutritive function. Important point is growth factors are there in the amniotic fluid, and these growth factors, they are comparable to those found in human milk, and they play a very important role in fetal growth and development. Another important role of the amniotic fluid is the innate immune system. That many of the substances which are there in the amniotic fluid, which are there for innate immunity, they are found in amniotic fluid and Vernix also. Next is the fetal lung and development. These things we tell our patients every day, that when the fluid is less, what is the importance and what is the function. But let us understand to a little bit depth that how does that function happen. So lung development is affected by many factors, and amniotic fluid adequacy is very important. And apart from that, availability of the thoracic space and neuromuscular function is another important point for lung development. Now, one important thing is that fetal urine is very important contributor in amniotic fluid, and kidney is a major source of proline. And proline aids in formation of collagen and mesenchyme in the lungs. That is why amniotic fluid adequacy is important for lung maturation. When we see there is renal agenesis, we often tell the patient that there will be problem in the lung development. So this is one of the basic point we should understand. It has got an effect on fetal gastrointestinal tract development. It helps in maturation. Partially it is enhanced by swallowed amniotic fluid. Because amniotic fluid has got the growth factors, so the trophic growth factors, which is similar to the epidermal growth factors, they are there in the amniotic fluid, which helps in the development of the gastrointestinal tract. Then it is a very good source of pluripotent stem cells. I wish the stem cell banking people should work on this. I think the cost will come down. So amniotic fluid assessment is a vital thing for the fetal well-being, and accurately diagnosing the amniotic fluid abnormality, it is an aid in the proper management of the pregnancies which are at risk of adverse outcome. So how do we do the assessment of the amniotic fluid for the pregnancy? So there are two methods, a subjective method and a semi-quantitative method. Subjective is just the sonographer, the radiologist will see how much is the fluid and give an assessment. Another one is the semi-quantitative assessment, where I give certain number to it. Semi-quantitative can be amniotic fluid index that we usually see in our reports. Other way could be single deepest vertical pocket. Now there are shortcomings and better things also for both the methods. The merits, I would say, subjective assessment, it is very quick and efficient. When I am doing my general survey, the moment I put the probe and do a general survey for the abdomen, I get to know about the fluid status. And it does take into consideration the gestational age variation of the amniotic fluid, because at different gestation age it is different. The semi-quantitative method, which is the AFI and the deep vertical pool, it is simple, quick also, and it is reproducible. That is the best part of it. I say it is 10, or if I say it is 15, the other doctor who will be seeing can also make an assessment, or if she does the scan, she can see, okay, how much is the difference between both the values. The limitations. Subjective assessment, I see it is adequate, I have seen it, but the other person hasn't seen it. And most important part, it is very much reliable when an experienced person is saying that. So experience counts a lot in this method. And the best way to document will be the video clip. But are we supposed to give a video clip? Maybe Hitesh sir will tell us. Then lot of burden today, sir, on you. Then semi-quantitative assessment. AFI method may be affected by the movements, because as I'll show in my subsequent slides, how we are measuring. So the movements of the baby can affect the measurement of the amniotic fluid assessment. And a query about the mathematical correlation. That we are doing a linear measurement. So can a linear measurement be equated to the volume? Because volume is a three-dimensional thing. So how do we go about it? So first, the method of amniotic fluid index measurement was given by Phelan et al. And we divide the abdomen into 4 quadrants. We measure it in sagittal plane. The probe is kept perpendicular to the floor, and no pressure has to be there on the probe. These 4 salient points are very important for amniotic fluid measurement. If I show it in a pictorial way, this is how we divide, and the way we have to keep the probe, I'll show you a video as well. Each quadrant is measured from anterior abdominal wall down the pocket. The calipers should go up to the down of the pocket, and the pocket which we are measuring has to be at least 2 by 1 centimeter. This is a basic criteria. And in that pocket there should not be any umbilical cord, there should not be any fetal part. After 25 weeks of gestation, it correlates very well. So I'll just try to show a video to you where we are dividing the abdomen into 4 quadrants. This is how we do an imaginary division of the abdomen, and we put the probe perpendicular to the floor and we do the measurements. So next time when you are doing the amniotic fluid measurement in a pregnant lady, it has to be 4 quadrant imagination and then the further measurement. So when I am doing that probe movement on the abdomen, this is how it looks on the screen. I make 2 by 2 division of the screen so that I see clear pockets. If I make it 4, then those pockets become very small. We need to have real clarity when we are putting the calipers. So we divide the screen into 2, and amniotic fluid appears clear black. From anterior abdominal wall, we put the calipers down to the pocket. So 2 and 2, 4 measurements that we do. Now I come across certain parts in the amniotic fluid pocket, so I put my Doppler, and this is how I pick up the umbilical cord. So if I find the umbilical cord in that pocket, I am not going to calculate that pocket for my amniotic fluid index. Okay. Now pressure over the probe is another important thing. Sometimes we are in a hurry or we want to finish up the scan. We might be pressing the probe on the abdomen, but when we are making a count of amniotic fluid, no pressure over the abdomen. And see here, a keen observation will be required. If I am pressing, then the size of the pocket becomes small. If I release it, the size of the pocket is different. So pressure over the probe should not be there. We should keep a very lightly probe over the abdomen. Caliper placement is very important. I know there are certain points which I have reiterated again and again, but that is an important thing. We take sum of all the 4 quadrants, and that is how we get the amniotic fluid index. Normal values which we will take will be 5 to 24. Oligohydramnios when it is less than 5, polyhydramnios when it is more than 24. Deepest vertical pool was given by Manning, the same Manning who gave us the biophysical profile. We measure the deep vertical pool in any quadrant. It can be used as early as 2nd trimester. Normal is 2 to 8 centimeter. Oligohydramnios less than 2, polyhydramnios more than 8. The same kind of thing that we do for the pocket measurement, we here see a single pocket and a deep pool measurement. Use of color Doppler will help us to locate the cord. Like you can see the first image, I measure the whole pool, but the moment I put the Doppler, I see a umbilical cord over there. So my pocket size will decrease, but when I have an umbilical cord in that pocket does not come into my counting. So to summarize, polyhydramnios DVP more than 8 or AFI more than 24. Oligohydramnios when the pocket is less than 2 or AFI is less than 5. There is one or two direct method that I have a correct estimate of the amniotic fluid. Direct method, one can be directly at the cesarean section, you see how much is the fluid you have collected, but that is at the end of the pregnancy. Dye method is another one where we inject sodium immunohippurate, and it is an ideal compound in view of its lack of toxicity, rapid diffusion throughout the amniotic cavity. And it has got a very easy spectrophotometric analysis. But then it is an invasive method, it is time consuming, you need to have practice for that. You need a lab support to measure those spectrophotometric analysis, and it cannot be used to assess during the whole pregnancy. You cannot be injecting the dye every time you want to assess the fluid. So this method is mainly into the research purposes. Now, important point, does the ultrasound estimate of amniotic fluid volume correlate with actual methods? So, a lot of research says that USG estimated amniotic fluid volumes are moderately accurate for normal fluids, but they poorly identify the abnormal, that is either oligo or poly. So, it says that the correlation is not that near to perfect one. But how do I document my normal amniotic fluid then? So we have got curves, amniotic fluid volume curves, and they have been made by study at different gestational ages, and then the curves are made. Normal fluid volumes, they say less than 5th centile or 95th centile. I'll tell you what I mean by this thing. Whenever I measure a deep vertical pool or I measure the amniotic fluid index, I use a particular software for my obstetric ultrasounds. So I put this graph, and the measurement, you can see the red and the blue dots over there. The lower line, that is the 5th centile for that particular gestational age. The upper line is the 95th centile for that gestational age. The x-axis of the graph is the weeks of pregnancy, the y-axis is the amount of fluid. So the moment I put this graph, I get to know, okay, this amniotic fluid is around 50th centile, or it is at the upper limit of normal, or it is polyhydramnios. So it helps me a lot that after this value, I need to search for some anomaly or the reason why it is more. I need to do a TVS, because definitely a lady who has got a polyhydramnios need to have a transvaginal scan to know the cervical length. Now, an important point for the people who are very much interested in research and all nomograms and everything, that when we make the graph for these assessments, they say that particular method, quantile regression method, has to be used for creating these graphs so that we match our values very close to normalcy as much as possible. Now, both methods are acceptable, be it subjective or semi-quantitative, but they say DVP is preferred because the research says that fewer interventions without significant difference in outcome. Because what are we worried about? We are worried about the perinatal outcome. So we need to have a method which gives us very much better outcome and lesser of interventions. There has been a trial, the SAFE trial, which directly says that the single deepest pool method is favorable method, and especially in the low risk pregnancy. Because if it is a high risk one, definitely my viewpoint for that pregnancy will be different. And the Cochrane review says that amniotic fluid index increases the rate of diagnosis of oligohydramnios and the rate of induction of labor without improving the peripartum outcome. So the accurate it is very much important to have an accurate estimation of the amniotic fluid, because it helps in assessment of the fetal anatomy, the growth, function of the feto-placental unit. We screen for adverse pregnancy outcome. And definitely it is influenced by experience of the operator, the fetal position, different diagnostic criteria for the abnormal values. So we have to consider all these things when we are doing a amniotic fluid assessment. What about multiple pregnancies? In multiple pregnancies, we don't do amniotic fluid index calculation, we use DVP in them. So how many ever sac you have, a twin pregnancy, a triplet pregnancy, each sac you are going to measure only the deep vertical pool. The definition for oligo and poly remains the same as we had in singletons 2 and 8. And because amniotic fluid in normal multiple pregnancy, it is stable between 17 and 37 weeks. So only DVP is to be used in multiple pregnancy. So we try to see the placenta, we try to see the membrane, and then we do the deep pool measurements in multiple pregnancy. In dichorionic pregnancies, the etiology, it is comparable to the singletons because it is dichorionic, both of them are separate entities completely. But in monochorionics, if I see that one sac has got less fluid, the other sac has more, I am very much worried for TTTS, that is twin-twin transfusion syndrome. Or suppose if the laser had been done for them, then I need to think, is the pregnancy going into twin arterial perfusion taps? So, lot of attention in monochorionics. If it is TTTS, there will be oligohydramnios in one sac, the donor one, polyhydramnios in the recipient one. They will have Doppler changes. So here there is very important role that when we are seeing amniotic fluid discrepancies, we have to look for Dopplers as well. If it is oligo and normal sequence in a monochorionic one, then think about the selective fetal growth restriction. So just few scenarios with taking this topic forward. I'll keep the history very short. For time constraints, a 36-year-old second gravida para 1 referred in view of decreased liquor. No other significant history. These are the images that I see. You yourself can make out what can be the scenario. But see, the fetal parts and the approximation of the placenta, the fetal parts and the approximation of the uterine walls, very difficult way to locate the umbilical cord. So, I'm hardly able to see anything. I'm trying to do the anatomy survey. With great difficulty on a transvaginal scan, I see that the adrenal gland is very much close and parallel to the spine. So it is lying down sign of the adrenal. and it is speaking out. It is a complete renal agenesis. So the moment my less like her, and then I am into, am I dealing with some kind of anomaly, or what can be the reason for this less like her? History begins, but this lady did not have a history of rupture of membranes, leaking or anything. So this is clear-cut renal agenesis. So oligohydramnios complicates around 0.5 to 8% of the pregnancy. Prognosis is gestation age dependent. And the visual criteria, as we saw in this case, the moment we are doing a general survey, we get to know hardly any black space around and all the fetal parts crowding. And common definition will be for this pocket less than 2 or AFI less than 5. Lot of reasons for this premature rupture of membranes, mainly around 3 to 17% of the pregnancies. Fetal anomalies mainly involving the urinary tract, because kidney is a major source in second and third trimester. It can be twin-twin transfusion also if I see it in multiple pregnancies. Oligohydramnios with intact membrane, that is one important thing. So we should think about the fetal and the placental abnormalities, the growth restriction or some kind of aneuploidy. Maternal dehydration also causes oligohydramnios and certain medications. So even if I am doing a sonography, I cannot just get away doing a scan. I need to have a complete history of the mother, the medical aspect, the surgical aspect, what does she work, so I could get to know about her habits, and then further scan adds to my findings. Intrauterine growth restriction is another reason, and the postterm pregnancy. So oligohydramnios, I'll see very small pockets, the umbilical cord filling up the pockets, so definitely it shows us that yes, the liker is less. Sequelae, what is going to happen? So it is very much required for lung function and development. So pulmonary hypoplasia is one thing. Then skeletal deformities because the fetus is all crumpled up. And there will be marked deformation of the fetus because of the intrauterine constraints. Another case, a primey, 24 years old, 25 weeks, B positive. She walked in for opinion in view of excessive liker. Mother's blood sugar was evaluated, it was normal, no other significant history. The moment I scan her, I see that the amniotic fluid is 40 centimeter and no obvious anomaly noted, because if we have liker around, what else do we want to scan? We can see the baby very nicely. So polyhydramnios, it is mainly associated with congenital malformations. Me being into fetal medicine, I'll think of malformations first. Gastrointestinal malformations where obstructions are the first one which I think of, or non-obstructive bowel diseases. The central nervous system, because swallowing is involved. So is there any CNS defect that could affect that? Head and neck, respiratory, thoracic, cardiovascular, genitourinary, skeletal dysplasia, long list. Placental tumors, fetal hydrops, twin oligohydramnios and polyhydramnios sequence, and maternal diabetes also. Maternal diabetes is the one which we think first, but I will go this way, that anomalies first and then the diabetes. There can be congenital infections which may cause this. And if you have ruled out all these things, then we can label it as an idiopathic one or a rare cause of polyhydramnios, which we are not able to find out. Polyhydramnios will complicate around 3.5% of the pregnancies, volume greater than 2 liters. Visual criteria, here there is an obvious discrepancy between the size of the fetus and the amount of fluid and the size of abdomen and the gestation age. So normally when we are doing a second and third trimester scan, the fetal abdomen approximates either the anterior wall or the posterior wall of the uterus. But if you have a polyhydramnios, there will be mainly fluid all around. So polyhydramnios, I'll cut short this video. Same way the measurement we do in all 4 quadrants. But here you will see big pockets, big black spaces. The caliper placement has to be really very correct, straight down. And for this lady, it was a really massive polyhydramnios. And this case, which we really followed up very closely, a young girl having a lot of distension, lot of distress, and we did an amniocentesis microarray was normal for her. We did amnio drainage for her 3 times, and she had been really a very patient person. This baby landed up in growth restriction, and we had to take her up for cesarean section at 32 weeks because of the Doppler changes. The baby definitely was in an ICU for a long time. 2 months postnatal, then the baby started having poor feeding, vomiting, and no weight gain. That made us look into the case again. and further follow-up was continuously going on with the pediatrician, and this baby is being highly suspected of a triple A syndrome. Believe me, I heard this syndrome for the first time with this baby. This triple A, then I asked, and then the day the father was told that this baby is having triple A, from the pediatrician, he directly came into my OPD, "Madam, I want to speak to you." And I said, "What is it?" They are saying triple A. So before he comes to my OPD, I just googled out what is triple A syndrome. And it is achalasia cardia, alacrimia, and ACTH resistant adrenal failure. So I mean, that is really sad for the family. The baby is still under follow-up, and I'll keep this baby under follow-up to know how such things progress. So the key points: amniotic fluid index 5 to 24 normal, deep vertical pool 2 to 8, AFI as well as DVP, both of them are most defined method, and that is what we follow. Neither of the methods stands out as superior to the other when it comes to diagnosing the amniotic fluid abnormalities during the pregnancy. Twin gestation, use DVP, not the AFI. And I cannot end my lecture without my favorite amniocentesis. So it is the most widely performed invasive test, most commonly for genetic and the chromosomal abnormalities, because we have fetal cells into it. Fetal cells from genitourinary system, the gut, the biochemical products, they are removed for analysis. When do we do it? Abnormal screening result as T21, trisomy 21, or advanced maternal age, or sonographically detected structural abnormality, previous aneuploidy or something. Either there is a known chromosomal translocation in either of the parents, or inborn errors of metabolism in the family, or there is some genetic history in the family, sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, then we go for these methods. It is to be done 16-week onwards. There is no concept of early amniocentesis. Either it is first trimester screening, which we do invasive test as chorionic villus sampling up to 13 weeks, 6 days. If somebody has missed that window period, then 14-15 weeks we just wait, because there are certain reasons for it. 16 weeks onwards we do amniocentesis. The rate of miscarriage is less than 1%. It is same for chorionic villus sampling or amniocentesis. It depends upon the operator. Within the first 2 to 3 weeks following the procedure, the miscarriage may happen, but as I said, it depends upon the experience of the operator and what exactly is the condition why we are doing it. So amniocentesis, just the last video of my presentation. It is an ultrasound guided procedure. We do it under antibiotic coverage for our population. Many centers, they may not give even the antibiotic. It is a transabdominal procedure. Procedure takes hardly 3 minutes for the thing to be done. The sample is taken and it is sent to the genetic lab for further workup. Thank you.
It is associated with so many neurological and developmental problems, and is a big load on the health system. So for all that reason, it is very important, and we all know that there is no single or a combined predictor which tells us for sure with very high sensitivity that this woman is likely to have a preterm labor, and also at the same time have very high specificity, so as to prevent very so many unnecessary interventions. But I think the cervical assessment is one very practical and cost-effective method which can help us. The others which we have been coming across, the biomarkers, I think they are so much academic and not practical. So this is a very good topic. So without taking much of time, I'll introduce our guest speaker, who is from Mumbai, Dr. Priya Deshpande. She has done her fellowship in fetal medicine from BFMC, is a consultant in fetal medicine, Motherhood Hospital and Apollo Hospital, Navi Mumbai, and is a faculty at FGI. She is also treasurer AFMC Maharashtra, OS Zone coordinator for FOXI ISC, and has special interest in fetal interventions and fetal therapy. So over to you, Dr. Priya Deshpande.
Really a good team leader for us, and this is our first physical CME. We were all involved in the webinar so far. So that also is one excitement to really travel to a place and see all. And Dr. Anupa, we have never met, but I'm a part of the Dr. Saris group, and we keep looking at your beautiful saris, and really, I wonder, oh my God, is she really a doctor who looks so good and with such amazing poses, and you've really been inspiring to us, and it's good to see you today in person. Okay, so yes, so they have connected my laptop finally. Yeah, my topic today we have taken a different type or maybe category of topics, because normally we keep talking about fetal anomalies, fetal screening, first trimester, Down syndrome. So Ms. Pita and me thought, no, we should just change this a bit and keep it more practical from an obstetrician's point of view. So she has spoken about amniotic fluid, and amniotic fluid is just now, okay, measure kar lo and how much it is. She spoke so much on it, isn't it? So it was really good, Smita. I like the talk. And now I will be going a little away from the fetus and amniotic fluid to the cervix. Um, Having said that, cervix and cervical screening, although is a very simple thing, but the impact that it has is quite large, because it predicts preterm labor, and we know, as ma'am also said, that preterm labor has the incidence is quite high. It's a major public health problem, because there's a lot of neonatal morbidity, mortality, and also health economics, because we know NICU admissions and ICU price, the cost of NICUs, then every year about 1 million babies die from prematurity, and many survivors are disabled also. And this global preterm birth rate is 11%. So although we keep talking about Down syndrome, this syndrome, that syndrome, if we practically have a look, preterm birth is much more of a greater problem and more practical and also preventable. So that's why I chose this topic to discuss today. And in 2015, the global burden of disease, preterm birth was ranked as 5th as the leading cause of disease burden over time. So that stresses upon the reason why we've chosen this. Now, despite great medical advances in preventing maternal and fetal mortality in the past century, one issue remains important. What is the best strategy to reduce this preterm birth rate and also to improve the neonatal outcome? Now, there are essentially two reasons why we've still failed to reduce preterm births, because we've advanced so much in technology and in ultrasound and even in obstetrics. But why we've failed on this front? Because there's absence of effective screening test to identify the women who are at high risk, and a lack of effective intervention as well. Now, intervention we can do, but doing it at the right time is important to prevent this complication. So a rational prediction has an explanation which is based on theory. So let's have a look at the theory. Now, how do we do the risk assessment? For any problem, first is history. All our teachers in our MBBS, the first step they have told us is history. So history is important. And secondly, examination. So in this context, we are examining the cervical length directly. So these are the two major parameters on which we assess the risk for preterm birth. And now what do we ask in the history? The previous cervical, of course, some surgery, or curettage, or excisional surgery, previous late miscarriage, and previous preterm birth. Now, previous late miscarriage and preterm birth is a very significant history, because it's the strongest predictor of preterm birth, and it has as high a chance as 32% of recurrent preterm birth. So that is something which we have to note down, so that we red flag these women and keep them in mind to do the screening more with a little more diligence. So cervical insufficiency, what is it? It's a noteworthy entity, but it has lots of controversies. Now, assessment of the cervix, when we do it at mid-trimester, the cervical length of 25 millimeter. Now, that is the cutoff which we take. And why we take that cutoff? That because it corresponds to 10th centile in this gestational group. So, normally, like even Smita showed us all the charts. So, any measurement we take, BPD, maybe AFI or anything, we just plot it on a graph. We even show these graphs to the patients, because it's easy for them to understand. कि अब तो growth ये यहाँ नीचे आ रहा है, ये level पे है, वो level पे है. So that's basically the centiles. So cervical length also 25 millimeters, the 10th centile. That's the lower cutoff. And here this is from a paper which was published. It showed that 25 millimeter cervical length corresponds to 1.1% risk of having preterm labor. As it reduces to 15 millimeter, the risk of preterm birth increases from 1 to 4%. And as it goes to 5 mm, it is exponential rise to 80%. So the length, the residual cervical length is so much important, and that's why we need to keep on monitoring this. Now, ideal screening tool, we know ultrasound. So it's easy to learn for even now, there's no fetal medicine here because it's a transvaginal probe and every obstetrician can do it in their OPD, in their wherever they have access to ultrasound. Because it's available, it is cost effective, it is acceptable to pregnant women. We just need to explain them the importance. Yes, we know every time we say TVS and the woman will like, nahi, upar se ho jayega, kya nahi. But if we explain it to them why we are doing it, if she has a history suggestive of that, then definitely. Yeah, my topic today we have taken a different type or maybe category of topics, because normally we keep talking about fetal anomalies, fetal screening, first trimester, Down syndrome. So Ms. Pita and me thought, no, we should just change this a bit and keep it more practical from an obstetrician's point of view. So she has spoken about amniotic fluid, and amniotic fluid is just now, okay, measure kar lo and how much it is. She spoke so much on it, isn't it? So it was really good, Smita. I like the talk. And now I will be going a little away from the fetus and amniotic fluid to the cervix. Having said that, cervix and cervical screening, although is a very simple thing, but the impact that it has is quite large, because it predicts preterm labor, and we know, as ma'am also said, that preterm labor has the incidence is quite high. It's a major public health problem because there's a lot of neonatal morbidity, mortality, and also health economics, because we know NICU admissions and ICU price, the cost of NICUs, then every year about 1 million babies die from prematurity, and many survivors are disabled also. And this global preterm birth rate is 11%. So although we keep talking about Down syndrome, this syndrome, that syndrome, if we practically have a look, preterm birth is much more of a greater problem and more practical and also preventable. So that's why I chose this topic to discuss today. And in 2015, the global burden of disease, preterm birth was ranked as 5th as the leading cause of disease burden over time. So that stresses upon the reason why we've chosen this. Now, despite great medical advances in preventing maternal and fetal mortality in the past century, one issue remains important. What is the best strategy to reduce this preterm birth rate and also to improve the neonatal outcome? Now, there are essentially two reasons why we've still failed to reduce preterm births, because we've advanced so much in technology and in ultrasound and even in obstetrics. But why we've failed on this front? Because there's absence of effective screening test to identify the women who are at high risk, and a lack of effective intervention as well. Now, intervention we can do, but doing it at the right time is important to prevent this complication. So a rational prediction has an explanation which is based on theory. So let's have a look at the theory. Now, how do we do the risk assessment? For any problem, first is history. All our teachers in our MBBS, the first step they have told us is history. So history is important. And secondly, examination. So in this context, we are examining the cervical length directly. So these are the two major parameters on which we assess the risk for preterm birth. And now what do we ask in the history? The previous cervical, of course, some surgery, or curettage or excisional surgery, previous late miscarriage, and previous preterm birth. Now, previous late miscarriage and preterm birth is a very significant history, because that's the strongest predictor of preterm birth, and it has as high a chance as 32% of recurrent preterm birth. So that is something which we have to note down, so that we red flag these women and keep them in mind to do the screening more with a little more diligence. So cervical insufficiency, what is it? It's a noteworthy entity, but it has lots of controversies. Now, assessment of the cervix, when we do it at mid-trimester, the cervical length of 25 millimeter. Now, that is the cutoff which we take. And why we take that cutoff? That because it corresponds to 10th centile in this gestational group. So So normally, like even Smita showed us all the charts. So any measurement we take, BPD, maybe AFI or anything, we just plot it on a graph. We even show these graphs to the patients because it's easy for them to understand. कि आपका growth ये यहाँ नीचे आ रहा है, ये level पे है या वो level पे है. So that's basically the centiles. So cervical length also 25 millimeters is the 10th centile. That's the lower cutoff. And here this is from a paper which was published. It showed that 25 millimeter cervical length corresponds to 1.1% risk of having preterm labor. As it reduces to 15 millimeter, the risk of preterm birth increases from 1 to 4%. And as it goes to 5 mm, it is exponential rise to 80%. So the length, the residual cervical length is so much important. And that's why we need to keep on monitoring this. Now, ideal screening tool, we know ultrasound. So it's easy to learn for even now, there's no fetal medicine here because it's just a transvaginal probe and every obstetrician can do it in their OPD, in their wherever they have access to ultrasound. Because it's available, it is cost effective, it is acceptable to pregnant women. We just need to explain them the importance. Yes, we know every time we say TVS and the woman will like, nahi, upar se ho jayega, kya nahi. But if we explain it to them why we are doing it, if she has a history suggestive of that, then definitely we can convince them about this. Now this, a few societies, the Society of Fetal Maternal Medicine, SMFM, ACOG, American College of Obstetricians, ISUOG. So all of them have the consensus which says that women who have history of prior spontaneous preterm birth or who have history of late miscarriage, like to 16 to 24 weeks of gestation, these women should be screened. Now what do you mean by screen? Screened by transvaginal cervical length examination. So what is the problem here? Like we are comparing our assessment of cervical length by doing a transvaginal scan either in each and every woman or in women who have this high risk history. So all these societies majorly agree to the fact that we should do it in women who have, at least in women who have this high risk history, and we should not avoid doing it because it really adds on and gives us vital information and also helps us in preventing preterm birth. And in twins, of course, we know because twins being a high risk pregnancy and preterm is such a high incidence in twins pregnancy. So that's why even in these twin pregnancies, transvaginal scan and cervical length assessment is recommended. Now, universal cervical length screening, so that's the controversy. Some of the groups like FIGO Working Group of Best Practice, it says that it is accurate it was accurate in its statement in favor to universal screening of pregnant women by mid-trimester transvaginal ultrasound measurement of the cervical length. So this was a group which said, no, you just do a transvaginal cervical length in everyone because you might be able to still pick up many women with short cervix. Now, this was a few clinical studies and the study was published in 2019 and that showed that there was 20% decline in preterm birth before 34 weeks and 27% decline in this rate less than 32 weeks. So that really adds on to a lot of information and also lessens the burden of preterm births and the NICU admissions and so on and so forth. This is CLEAR program. So this was created in 2011 by Perinatal Quality Foundation. So what is CLEAR? It is cervical length education and review. And it is accepted as a protocol by different organizations like ACOG, SMFM and all. So it just gives us a criteria of how are we going to measure this. First of all, the measurement is taken on a transvaginal image and the image should be zoomed like it is shown here. So it should be zoomed enough to fill the screen completely. The anterior width of cervix and the posterior should be equal. The bladder should be empty. Internal os should be clearly seen. External os is of course seen in most of the cases. The endocervical canal, we have to make sure it is visible throughout. And that's why when we are doing all of this, we've magnified, we've seen all the points and the caliper placement is going to be accurate. And the shortest of the 3 acceptable measurements is taken and is reported. So this is the way in which we should assess the gold standard. And because it's not affected by maternal obesity or cervical position or in few cases we see shadowing because of the fetal parts. So all that doesn't affect a transvaginal method and of course it is most sensitive. This is a test which is cervical stress test. Sometimes we apply it in cases of doubt. Now what we do is just a slight pressure on the fundus and done in the period of gestation between 15 to 24 weeks. So if we increase the pressure, we can, because normally if we are doing a transvaginal scan and seeing the cervical length, it just looks okay. But a little pressure and the funnel opens up. So that stress test sometimes in our clinical practice helps to differentiate, and also it then gives us a good residual length measurement. Okay, so this is an animated video of how the process of cervical shortening, opening and the bulging of membranes happens, and these are the signs which we see on our ultrasound, and see that's the bag of membrane, how it bulges into the vaginal canal. So we know this TY-VU, trust your vaginal ultrasound. TY-VU are the shapes of the internal os and the upper cervical canal which we see, but not necessarily in a sequence. So this is T, a small funnel looks like a Y, then it opens up V, and in almost inevitable cases we see it as a U with a bag of membrane which is bulging. So this is one more entity which is called as hourglass cervix, as this cervical canal is completely open and the bag is bulging into the vaginal canal. So this is something which that's the stage at which we can hardly help. What are the special cases? A curved cervix. Now as we can see here in the image, the cervical length, if we take along the curve, then the measurement is going to be more. But if we take it from point A to B as the internal and external os, it is going to be short. But from clinical point of view, what we should remember is when the cervix is short, it is always straight. So if we are seeing a curved cervix, it essentially is going to be a normal. So in such cases, we can use the trace method. Cervical funneling. Now what is funneling? We many a times obstetricians get reports that there's funneling. Yes, funneling is there, funneling is not there. So funneling is just protrusion of the amniotic membranes into the cervical canal, and it is not an independent risk factor. So if we see a funneling, that's not a risk factor. The risk factor is the residual cervical length. After the upper part of the cervix is funneled, the residual cervical length which we measure, that gives us the risk assessment. Like we'd seen when the cervical length is 25 millimeter, 15 millimeter, 5 millimeter. So that is the point which is more significant. In few cases, if people who are scanning must have seen, there's something like this, the hazy plug-like thing. That's called as amniotic fluid sludge. So these are echogenic aggregates. They are close to the internal os, or they are within the funnel. And that is associated with microbial invasion into the amniotic cavity and histological cause. Basically, it is an indicator of some kind of infection. Histological chorioamnionitis in asymptomatic patients at high risk for spontaneous preterm. So when we see the sludge, we should know that that is a sign when there is some kind of subclinical infection, and that increases the risk for preterm delivery. So it's an independent risk factor. So independent risk factors are residual cervical length and the sludge. So as we know, multiple pregnancies, of course because of the mechanics, of course because of the pressure, so the risk is significantly higher, more than 50%. Iatrogenic preterm delivery is increased because we know there are complications like TTTS and selective FGR and preeclampsia, so they as such increase the risk of preterm delivery in multiple pregnancies. There's one more theory regarding the increased incidence, that is secretion of corticotropin releasing hormone from the large placental mass. So in twins, the placenta, if it's a monochorionic, the single placenta is large, or if it's dichorionic, there are two placentae. So the large placental mass is it secretes levels of factors that are produced by the maturing lung, and they such as surfactant protein and all, and they stimulate the myometrial contractility. So there are two theories why preterm labor happens more in multiple pregnancy. So routine screening of all multiple pregnancies by TVS is a good practice point. So this paper published in 2006 by Kypros Nicolaides group,
it showed that cervical length measurement is far superior than just history in prediction of risk. Now, should we take just one measurement sometimes when she comes to us for an anomaly scan, or should we keep monitoring? So this study, which was published in 2020, it showed that if we do serial measurements, like every time a woman comes to us for a scan for checking the fetal growth, we should also check the cervical length by doing a transcervical ultrasound. Now why? Because it showed better performance of serial measurements, and also we could detect half of preterm deliveries not at mid-trimester but at 28 weeks of gestation. And that's why we always, when a woman comes to us for monitoring of growth, we also need to check the cervical length. Now this has happened to one of my patients when she went for follow-up in between somewhere else, and somebody did not do the transvaginal scan and the cervical length was missed, and when she came it was completely open and the bag of memories was bulging. So that time we can't really help. So this is a simple step, but really gives us good results, because a stitch in time would have really saved that pregnancy. Now a few research articles. This was published in 1998 by Kypros Nikolaides group, and it showed that when we see the cervical length, which is less than 15 millimeters, then it gives an accurate prediction. That is, about 90% of women who will deliver as preterm as 28 weeks, and 60% who will deliver as early as 32 weeks could be picked up. In 2006, again the same group told us that we should integrate the history and the measurement. Now, everybody says every scan will do this, it will really increase the time and it will be a very tedious task. So they conducted one more study which was recently published in 2020, and the results showed that every time you do a tedious, around 5 to 10 minutes are added to your ultrasound examination. However, if you keep on doing this in your routine practice, it will diminish with increased experience, but it will add a lot of value to our clinical practice. So now we know that the generalized practice has stopped and we are individualizing risk assessment for every pregnancy. So individualization of risk assessment for cervical screening has also been studied. And these papers showed that if you customize the assessment of preterm risk depending on her gestational age, depending on her parity, on her weight, on her height,